3 Houses, a memoir by Angela Thirkell. Read by Judy Bond. Angela Thirkell, 1890 to 1961, granddaughter of the pre-Raphaelite painter Sir Edward Burne-Jones, cousin of Rudyard Kipling, and mother to novelist Colin MacInnes, was born in Kensington Square, London. A prolific author, she wrote over 30 novels in her lifetime, mostly set in Barsetshire. 3 Houses, a memoir of her childhood, was her first book and became an immediate success on its publication in 1931. Introduction. Richardson's Grotto. In the summer of 1751, Samuel Richardson invited a party of friends to his country house at North End to hear a reading of the manuscript of Sir Charles Grandison in the Grotto. His guests were Mr. Mulso, Mr. Edward Mulso, Mr. Highmore, Miss Mulso, afterwards Mrs. Chapone, Miss Prescott, afterwards Mrs. Mulso, Mr. Duncombe, a clergyman, and Miss Highmore, who afterwards married Mr. Duncombe. Mr. Highmore had been engaged on a portrait of Mr. Richardson, and Miss Highmore, who was also something of an artist, made a drawing of the company, seated in the grotto. It is a bare, plastered room with a stone floor, a few steps below the level of the garden, looking out onto a pleasant vista of gravel path and waving poplars. Mr. Richardson, in a brown turban and wrapper, is seated with his legs crossed, an attitude which the young artist found it a little difficult to reproduce in a convincing way, reading aloud. The gentlemen are sitting in various elegant and unstudied attitudes, a hand thrust into the waistcoat, or waving approval. The ladies, in black gowns and white kerchiefs, with black shady hats over their white caps, cluster round a table on the right. Miss Highmore herself is occupied with what looks like a book and a pencil, as if in the act of transferring Mr. Richardson's venerated features to paper. Miss Highmore, writing later to Miss Mulso, said, "I should think that you did my rude sketch too much honour by preserving it and taking it with you, were it not for the respectable persons attempted to be represented." Luckily, the future Mrs. Chapone valued the rude sketch, and when in 1804 Mrs. Anna Letitia Barbode made her selections from Richardson's correspondence in 6 volumes, Richard Phillips, the publisher, had it reproduced in colour as a frontispiece to the 2nd volume. North End Lane was far out of London then, the best part of a mile beyond the gates of Holland House, and well on the road to Richmond and Twickenham. But the female admirers and their swains came undauntedly in their heavy coaches to taste the delights of tea-drinking and literary conversation with the kindly old man, so susceptible to their flattery. Johnson, we know, wrote of him as an author who has enlarged the knowledge of human nature and taught the passions to move at the command of virtue. But it is difficult now to think of Richardson in these terms, and we see him rather as Henry Esmond Warrington saw him at Tunbridge Wells, the immortal, little, kind, honest man with the round paunch, a bevy of admiring ladies surrounding him. Richardson died in 1761, and his world departed. But the house with the grotto remained. The mulberry tree in the garden grew and spread, and more than 100 years after his death, a poet and a painter, walking on a Sunday afternoon by fields and lanes from Kensington, saw it and was strongly attracted by it, as it stood tenantless. The poet was William Allingham, now better known through the black-and-white illustration that Rossetti made for his poem The Maids of Elfinmere. The painter was Edward Burne-Jones. my grandfather was then looking for a house where he could live and paint, and the Grange, in spite of early 19th century alterations and a layer of stucco over the old red brick front, was full of charm, and possessed one large room on the first floor which could be made into a studio. So, in 1867, he and my grandmother went to live there, and for 30 years the house was filled with hopes, work, love, and the constant intercourse of many friends. The original twin houses were built by Justice Smith in 1713-14. About 1836 they came to be known as the Grange, the name which the North House has kept. Richardson took the North House on lease in 1739, and Pamela, Clarissa Harlowe and Sir Charles Grandison were all written there. The Grange passed through various hands, and in 1863 the houses were inhabited by the 4th Marquess of Londonderry, who threw them into one, making several structural alterations. In 1867, when my grandparents went to live there, the two houses were again separated, but the North House had lost some of its original character, and its handsome square staircase had been replaced by a long flight of stairs opposite the front door against the party wall. It is not known exactly when the front was stuccoed over, but it was probably in the early years of the 19th century. At the same time, the dignified sash windows at the front of the house were reduced in number and clumsily altered. The South House is still in its original state, and is by far the more handsome, as it is the larger of the two. North End Lane was a shabby enough thoroughfare at its northern end, but as one walked down it, the little houses and shops soon came to an end, and there were prosperous, comely red brick houses of Queen Anne's time, each standing in its own garden with fields behind. Today these fields and gardens are covered with mean houses or ugly pretentious flats, and genteelism has renamed the district West Kensington. But the words, the Grange, North End Lane, Fulham, take me back to the 1890s, and summers of miraculous length and warmth when it was always Sunday and one played for endless hours in a sunny garden. Part 1. The Grange. I suppose everyone has a mental picture of the days of the week, some seeing them as a circle, some as an endless line, and others again, for all I know, as cubes and triangles. Mine is a wavy line proceeding to infinity, dipping to Wednesday, which is the colour of old silver dark with polishing, and rising again to a pale gold Sunday. This day has a feeling in my picture of warmth and light breezes and sunshine, and afternoons that stretch to eternity, and mornings full of far-off bells. How varying are the evocations of bells! They have almost as much power to startle a memory to life as the odours which annihilate the years between us and our childhood. Wherever I am in the world, a grey, warm Sunday, with the sound of bells coming damped through quiet, unceasing rain, will mean Oxford to me. In the underworld, 12,000 miles away, that sound of bells in steady rain has translated me for a moment to Oxford in early summer, and the scented drip from hawthorn and laburnum. And even now, to hear bells in London on a June morning makes me lose the many intervening years and go back to a pale gold Sunday when the sun shone on an endless leisured day. Long ago, say 35 years ago, a little girl used to wake on Sunday morning feeling that a whole life of happiness lay before her in the day. She had a low bed in her mother's room, and her mother had a 4-post bed with thick curtains patterned with birds. If it was not too early, and her mother was awake, she was allowed to get into the big bed and have conversations till the dressing gong rang and the smell of sausages began to rise from the kitchen. Sunday sausages. What a world of emotion in the words. Sacred Sunday sausages, I'd almost said. There can be no other dish which so obviously fits the day, especially with bread fried in the same pan. Some are fat and burst in the middle. Others have a little twist at the end, which we called the nightcap. But all are divine. What a pleasant, leisurely meal was Sunday breakfast. There was no motor to be propitiated, and all one's friends were in town and could be visited later in the day. So breakfast could go slowly from sausages to scones and butter and honey, and then to strawberries and cherries. The little girl's mother would read aloud afterwards, while we all sat at the table and, pushing aside cups and plates, drew pictures out of whatever book was being read. During a reading of Burnt Nial, one of the children drew an imaginary portrait of Scarpedin, and he was used to mark the places in all our Sunday morning books, till Scarpedin became synonymous with bookmarker in the family. So breakfast took its leisurely course till 11 o'clock or so, when we had to go upstairs and be cleaned and dressed for Sunday lunch with our grandparents. Perhaps the golden haze is needed when we come to Sunday clothes, for they were a little inhuman compared with the freedom of today. My brother may have been let off comparatively lightly, with blue blouse and knickerbockers, a holland smock, brown shoes and socks, and a sailor hat whose elastic was always too tight or too loose. But for me, there was the ordeal of starch. Buttonholes starched so stiffly together that one couldn't force the buttons into them. Starched petticoats were rather fun to put on, because they crackled so as you pulled the folds apart, but had complications of starched tapes at the neck, which needed Nanny's relentless fingers. White piqué frocks with full sleeves standing up like crinolines, and all the hooks ironed flat so that Nanny had to lever them open with the nursery nail scissors. White pinafores with frills round the neck, white cotton gloves, well stiffened, into which one's hot hands were with difficulty thrust. Black shoes and long stockings, and then the straw hat with a wreath of flowers, and the inevitable elastic. How it hurt when it was half an inch too short, and how inelegant it looked when Nanny had tied a knot in the middle to shorten it. At last we were ready, and set out with our father and mother for North End Lane, Fulham. All that neighbourhood is genteel now, and the street is called North End Road, West Kensington. But while this golden Sunday lasts, we need not think of changes. We went up Young Street from Kensington Square, past the old shops at the corner, past John Barker's little drapery establishment, and got into a red horse-bus opposite the church. 6 on each side inside, and 14 outside. How small it sounds now. The table of fares, hand-painted, with its convention of a wiggly line connecting stopping places and fares, did not hold more than a dozen names. On we went, past the old brick houses standing back on both sides of the road then, past the leafage of Holland Park, past more terraces of old houses, and over the railway bridge. No buses went down North End Lane, and we walked along past early 18th century houses, each in its own garden of elms and cedars and mulberries. The air was warm, the sun shone on the blossoming trees hanging over the brick walls, and so we came to the Grange. The Grange stood a little back from the road, behind a brick wall with an iron gate in it. A short flagged path led to the low front door. It had a glazed upper half and green silk curtains to prevent people looking in, but people of the right size could always look through the letterbox. The low square hall must once have been a front parlour, but it had been thrown into the passage and made a pleasant room to play in, heated in winter by a large green earthenware stove called pither. At its further end were the stairs and a long passage leading to the drawing-room and the door to the kitchen quarters. On Sunday, my grandparents kept open house. 2 or 3 extra places were laid at lunch for any friends who might drop in, but whoever came, I sat next to my grandfather. I was allowed to blow into the froth of his beer, to make a bird's nest, or to have all the delicious outside from the mashed potatoes when they had been browned in the oven. If, disregarding truth, I said that at home my toast was always buttered on both sides, my statement was gravely accepted, and the toast buttered accordingly. There can have been few granddaughters who were so systematically spoilt as I was, and it is a legend that the only serious difference of opinion which ever arose between Gladstone and Burne-Jones was as to which of them spoilt an adored grandchild the more. After lunch, my grandfather often settled down to a game of draughts, which was a good moment for my brother and myself to escape and do a little exploring upstairs. My grandparents surprisingly clung to the Victorian convention of a drugget, and though a thick, piled Morris carpet was on the stairs, I do not remember ever seeing it without its cover. At the top of the staircase was a long landing with rooms opening off it, but just in front of us, 3 broad, shallow steps went up to the studio. Their banisters curled outwards at the bottom, and a child could squeeze comfortably behind them and be in a little house. At the top of these steps, a window on the right looked out over the large garden next door. Here, too, was kept a kind of gigantic tin bath on wheels, painted red, filled with water in case of fire. It was a lucky day if we were able to slip into the studio, which was, as a rule, absolutely forbidden. Sinister people called models lived there, who had trays taken up to them at lunch and tea time. There was a strange smell of oil and turpentine. It was very easy to lose things. My necklace or pencil, once rashly pushed through the grating in the floor where the hot water pipes lived, was irrecoverable. Even more rashly, one might push one's belongings through one of those mysterious S-shaped holes by which the studio seats and stands were picked up and carried about. This done, they would rattle about till doomsday, like the silver egg-spoon which my brother put down the hole of the rocking horse's pommel, and nothing would get them out. Then there were gloomy corners fenced off by canvases, where at any moment one might bring an easel clattering down on one's head, or upset a little china pipkin full of some precious mixture. As long as I can remember, there was a studio man who stoked the furnace, did odd jobs, and kept the brushes and palettes clean. The first studio man we knew was called William, because his name was so impossibly Albert. He had been in South Africa, and I remember crying with rage when he confessed, under severe cross-examination, that the Kaffir children were more like my brother's shoes, which were dull black, than like mine, which were patent leather. He was replaced in time by Pendry, a strange, dwarfish creature who could play the Jew's harp with exquisite skill and imitate Punch, and convulse the nursery by pretending to fall down with fright at the dragons on a Chinese rug. Beyond the big studio was an inner room, down a few steps, a place of great danger to us, for here lived the lay figure, its arms and legs at preposterous angles, its papier-mâché head perched rakishly on its long neck. By daylight we jeered at it, and it was known as silly, but we had some dread of its possible powers by night. From this room a door led to my grandmother's sitting room, but it was never used. It was in this sitting room, papered with the pomegranate pattern on a dark blue ground, that I had my only remembered sight of William Morris, of whom, although he was such an old friend and so often at the house, we children saw but little. It is entirely unworthy of notice. except for the peculiar circumstances which imprinted it on my memory. I was trying to read a book which I had laid on the carpet, while my body and legs were on the sofa and my elbows on the floor. This attitude of extreme discomfort appears to have been necessary to make me notice the old man, or so I thought him, with the aggressive mop of white hair, who was talking, between fits of coughing, to my grandmother. Having succeeded in visiting the studio unseen, it was just as well to slip away again before our absence was noticed, so we decided to give the kitchen the pleasure of our company and ran downstairs and along the back part of the hall. Here under the stairs lived another red fire-bath, I really don't know what else to call it, and yards of neatly coiled canvas hose, which I am sure no one would have known how to use if there had been any danger. On the other side of the hall was the service hatch to the kitchen, but looking through it we found that the inhabitants were still sitting at dinner, so we judged it better to keep away for the present. At this point there was a choice of pleasures. We could go into the drawing-room and so through the French windows to the garden, or take the long passage with the skylight. This route had the advantage of avoiding the grown-ups, who would probably want to stop one doing what one wanted, or make one do something one didn't want to do, so we went quickly down the passage, past the filter. The long, narrow store cupboard on the left was unfortunately kept locked, or we might have put in some good work among the currants and lump sugar. The garden, full of sunshine, gleamed alluringly through the open door at the end of the passage, and out we ran. As soon as we were out of the house, we might have been in the country. Gardens surrounded us on all sides, and only a few years earlier there had been fields behind the little orchard which bounded the further end. Ugly brick houses had been built since then, but they were hidden by the long white rough-cast studio which stood between the orchard and the road. It was called the Garden Studio, and here my grandfather worked on his larger canvases. It was a little alarming to us. The red-tiled entrance and steps which led down to the furnace room where we were never allowed to go, and anything one felt might live. The iron grills in the floor to let in the warm air for winter days, the tall narrow slit in the outer wall through which finished pictures were passed. Sometimes these pictures went to exhibitions, but more often straight to the friend or patron, in the very best sense of the word, who had commissioned them, and was content to wait for years, if need be, for the perfect expression of the artist's mind. In this studio there was a very high set of steps, with a higher and lower platform, on which the artist worked at the upper portions of his picture. I remember sitting on these steps, my head wrapped in a many-coloured piece of silk and bound with a coronet, while my grandfather made studies of crown and drapery for one of the mourning queens in the great unfinished picture of Arthur in Avalon, which is now in the Tate Gallery. Here, too, he was working at the time of his death on the picture, also unfinished, of the Car of Love, now at South Kensington, where Love, standing in a great brazen chariot, is drawn through the thundering streets of some imagined city by a throng of his worshippers, some happy, some stabbed with